Magic the Gathering has been around for more than 30 years, and over the decades, the game has undergone many changes. So many changes, in fact, that some Magic cards don't make sense anymore, and those are the cards we're going to be talking about today. Piracy. Coming from Portal, a series of 3 sets in the late 90s designed for new players just starting the game with simplified wording and mechanics that were sometimes a little bit strange, Piracy is super weird. It's single line of text. This turn, you may tap your opponent's lands to help pay for your spells. Seems pretty fun. Who wouldn't want to use their opponent's mana rather than their own mana to pay for things? But it has one huge problem. It doesn't actually make any sense. If you cast this sorcery, won't your opponent just tap all their lands in response so you can't steal their precious mana? Of course they will, which is why Piracy is essentially unplayable today. But back when it was printed in the 90s, it was actually way more powerful because alongside being a weird ramp spell, it was also a weird blue burn spell thanks to the mana burn rule. If you weren't playing Magic 30 years ago, mana burn was actually pretty simple. If you had extra mana in your mana pool at the end of a turn or a phase and it went to waste, you'd have to take 1 damage for each wasted mana. Let's say you had 10 lands untapped and your opponent cast a Piracy. Well, you could still tap all your lands in response, unless you had a way to use that mana at instant speed, you would end up taking a massive 10 damage. What this means in practice is, back when mana burn was a thing, your odds of using Piracy like a ramp spell were significantly higher since tapping all your lands actually carried a bunch of risk. But today, the only realistic way to get value out of the card is by hoping your opponent punts by not tapping their lands in response for some reason, which is why Piracy really doesn't make sense in the eyes of a modern Magic player. Another more recent example of how the removal of the mana burn rule made some cards make much less sense is Cold Snap's Braid of Fire. Today, Braid of Fire's cumulative upkeep, making an increasing amount of mana each turn, is pure upside. Best case, you can spend the mana on something during your upkeep. Worst case, it goes to waste, but whatever, it'll make more mana the next turn. But originally the card was supposed to come with some risk. If you couldn't find a way to spend your Braids of Fire mana on your upkeep, you take an increasing amount of mana burn damage from the mana going to waste. Hilariously, this is why Su-Chi makes 4 mana when it dies. When Su-Chi was first printed back in Antiquities, a 4/4 for 4 mana was considered very above the curve, especially for a colorless card. As such, Wizards added the "when this dies, make 4 mana" clause as a downside. Since you wouldn't often be able to spend the mana, what this death trigger was actually supposed to be was, when this dies, take 4 damage, at least most of the time. Today the ability looks like pure upside, which is why the card actually doesn't really make sense, because it's supposed to be a downside. The same is true of infamous commander counterspell Mana Drain. Originally the extra colorless mana was supposed to be a drawback as well as an upside. Sure, making a bunch of extra mana is great if you can spend it, but today Mana Drain is just a hilariously broken, strictly better counter spell since mana burn is no longer a thing. Want some cards that don't make sense anymore? Well, you can snag them all from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Master of Arms. Master of Arms is a 3-drop 2/2 from Weatherlight with one of the least logical lines of text in all of Magic. Pay a white and a generic mana to tap target creature that is blocking Master of Arms? Why would you possibly want to tap a creature that's already blocking one of your creatures? Doesn't this ability do literally nothing at all? Today that's all true. If you attack with a Master and your opponent blocks it and you activate the ability, nothing actually happens. Sure, your opponent's blocker is now tapped, but combat will still happen like normal, damage will still be dealt, things will still die, the same as if you hadn't activated the ability at all. But back before the 6th edition rule changes, Master of Arms actually made a lot more sense. This is because the rules at the time stated that if a creature was tapped, it couldn't deal damage. So back when Master of Arms was first printed, what you could do is attack and see how your opponent blocked, and then activate the ability to tap down any creatures that were big enough to kill the Master of Arms, and maybe kill a small creature along the way. This wasn't enough to make Master of Arms a good card back in its day. It is still just a 3-mana 2/2 after all, but at least this ability made some amount of sense with the old rules. Mirror Universe. Saying that Legends Mirror Universe doesn't make sense anymore might be a bit harsh. While the original wording is pretty clunky, the effect of tap it and sack it to exchange life totals with target opponent, but you can only do it on your upkeep, is actually pretty straightforward. So why is Mirror Universe on our list? Well, back when Mirror Universe was first printed, it was actually way more powerful than it is today because of a weird quirk in Magic's original rules. Today, when your life total hits 0, you die. Like immediately. You can't take any game actions or cast any spells. However, the first rules of Magic were a little bit different. Even once your life total hit 0, you'd survive until the end of the next phase, and then you die if you didn't have any life. What this means for Mirror Universe is that back when it was first printed, you could go to your upkeep and then use something like Necropotence to put your life total down to 0, and then with your life total at 0, exchange life totals with your opponent, which will put your opponent at 0 life, and then they would die as soon as you passed out of the upkeep. Hilariously, this actually led to Mirror Universe being restricted back in August of 1994, which at the time was essentially the equivalent of a banning, since bannings weren't really a thing in the early 90s, and it wasn't until 1999 that the card was unrestricted. Magic in the 90s was super weird. Serum Powder. Serum Powder is an incredibly unique card, the only card in Magic that gives you extra mulligans for free. Except now, thanks to some rule changes, it no longer makes sense as written. Back when Serum Powder was first printed, mulligans in Magic were pretty simple. You'd draw 7 cards, and if you didn't like that 7-card hand, you could mulligan and draw 6 cards, and then if you didn't like those 6 cards, you could mulligan and draw 5 cards, all the way down to 0 if you want to go that far. If you happen to have a Serum Powder in any one of those hands, you'd essentially just get 1 free mulligan. For example, let's say you mulligan down to 6, you could simply exile your Serum Powder hand and draw 6 more cards, and then keep on mulliganing as necessary. Today, though, we have the London Mulligan rule, where whenever you mulligan, you always draw 7 cards, and then once you finish mulliganing, you put a number of cards to the bottom of your library equal to the number of times that you mulliganed. This ended up being a bit awkward with Serum Powder. Let's say you mulligan down to 5, and then draw a Serum Powder. If you want to do a Serum Powder mulligan, you first have to put 2 cards to the bottom of your library, since you've already mulliganed twice, and then you exile your 5-card Serum Powder hand and draw a new 5-card hand. But then hilariously, if you mulligan again after that, down to 4, you'll draw a 7-card hand again, before eventually having to put even more cards to the bottom of your library. Morphling. When Morphling was first printed, back in Urza's Saga in 1999, it was widely considered to be the best creature ever made, to the point that it actually gained the nickname Superman, beating the seemingly inevitable Universes Beyond Superman to the punch. But why would a 5-mana 3/3 with a bunch of abilities that cost mana to activate be so strong? Well, it's true that the bar for being a good creature wasn't especially high back in 1999, since most creatures back then were woefully underpowered compared to spells. There's much more to this story. In April of 1999, Wizards announced the 6th edition rule changes, which included one rule that turned Morphling into the Superman of its day: damage going on the stack. Today, damage just happens, but back in 1999, damage actually used the stack similar to spells today. And this meant that you could do some ridiculous things with Morphling. Let's say that you attacked with a Morphling, and your opponent blocked with a 4/4 Masticore, another iconic creature of the era. What you could do is activate Morphling's ability to give it +1, -1 until end of turn to turn it into a 4/2, and then you could let damage happen, putting 4 damage to Masticore on the stack, and Masticore would also put 4 damage to Morphling on the stack. But then before the damage actually resolved, you could activate Morphling's -1 +1 ability a few times to turn it into a 1/5, which would allow it to survive the damage from the Masticore while also killing the Masticore. Another infamous damage on the stack card was Mog Fanatic, which didn't make our list today because honestly it still makes sense and isn't even that bad. bad, but it used to be way better when it was first printed, because you could attack with it or block with it, put 1 damage on the stack, and then sacrifice its ability to deal another damage, which is another shenanigan that doesn't work today since damage just happens and resolves all at once. All in all, it's probably unfair to say that Morphling doesn't make sense today, because all of its techs and abilities still work. But from the perspective of a 2025 Magic player, what definitely doesn't make sense is that this 5-mana 3/3 could be considered the greatest creature of all time, when if Morphling was first printed today, it might actually just be an uncommon. Companions. By far the most recent addition to our list, the 10 companions from 2020's Ikoria are some of the strongest creatures ever printed, but it only took a couple of months for them to stop making sense. Read Lurrus of the Dream Den, probably the best companion. As long as all of the permanents in your deck have mana value of 2 or less, Lurrus can be your companion, and you can cast it once from outside the game, which actually just means your sideboard. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, not exactly, because that's no longer how the companion mechanic actually works. As soon as companions were printed, they took over quite literally every Magic format and arguably destroyed the game. It turns out that starting the game with essentially 8 cards in your opening hand is strictly better than starting the game with 7 cards in your opening hand. Who would have guessed? Before long, nearly every deck in Magic was a companion deck of some kind, which forced Wizards to take the unprecedented step of eroding the entire mechanic just a couple of months after first printing it. Now, rather than casting your companion once a game from your sideboard, you would need to pay 3 mana to put your companion into your hand, and then you can play it from there just like any other card. It turns out that even with this new 3 mana tax, companions are still pretty busted, with the ban list from Pioneer all the way back to Vintage being littered with cards with the mechanic. But even more awkwardly, now companions don't make sense as written. Sure, if you go to Scryfall or Gather, you can find the Oracle text that will tell you about the errata and give you the updated text on the card. But if you just crack a companion in a pack without knowing the history of the mechanic, your odds of playing it correctly is very close to 0, because the way it's written on the card is just straight up wrong. Sure, there's plenty of older cards from back in the early 90s that don't work exactly as they read today. Creature types have been updated, wording has been improved, but what makes companions unique is just how recently they were printed. It's definitely too much to expect that cards printed back before many of us were even born to play exactly as they read, but it does seem like cards printed during the Fire Design era in 2020 should, but not the companions. Serene Heart. Serene Heart has one simple line of text: destroy all local enchantments. But what in the world is a local enchantment? Well, back in the early days of Magic, cards that enchanted permanents were called local enchantments. So Animate Wall, for example, would be a local enchantment. Meanwhile, enchantments that affected the entire game rather than just a single card, like Stasis, for example, were called global enchantments. However, when the core set 2010 rule changes came out, local enchantments became a thing of the past, with auras replacing local enchantments. All local enchantments were renamed as auras, while global enchantments became, well, just enchantments. As a result, the current text on Serene Heart says destroy all auras, although you wouldn't know that just by reading the card, because thanks to the rule change, its text no longer makes any sense. Fossil Find. Return a card at random from your graveyard to your hand. Pretty simple, but Shadowmoor's Fossil Find doesn't stop there, because then it says reorder your graveyard as you choose. Wait a minute, can I reorder my graveyard however I want, whenever I want? Do I really need to play a card to allow me to do this? Have I been cheating every time I move a creature to the top of my graveyard as I think about what I'm trying to reanimate? The answer is actually sort of complicated. Back in the earliest days of Magic, the order of your graveyard actually did matter. There are a total of 23 cards in Magic that in one way or another care about the order of your graveyard. The best of these is probably Shallow Grave, which is basically a Goryo's Vengeance, but rather than reanimating a legendary creature, it reanimates the top creature of your graveyard, which has allowed it to see some legacy play as one of the few cards that can reanimate an Emrakul the Eonstorn with its shuffle your graveyard into your library trigger on the stack. Nether Shadow also has shown up in in some dredge decks, while the other 21 cards are mostly either unplayable or just downright hilarious, like Search for Survivors, the only card in Magic that actually forces you to shuffle your graveyard. But Wizards pretty quickly realized that caring about the order of your graveyard wasn't especially fun, and it could actually be pretty annoying in some cases, so they stopped printing Graveyard Matters cards way back in 2000 with Search for Survivors, discounting fossil fuel itself, which doesn't technically care about the order of your graveyard, but it does work well with Graveyard Order Matters cards, since it lets you stack your graveyard however you want. So is it cheating to reorder your graveyard without a fossil find? The answer actually depends on what format you're playing. The current rule is you can reorder your graveyard whenever you want, for whatever reason you want, however you want, unless you're playing a format that allows cards printed back in the 90s. What this means in practice is if you're playing Legacy or Vintage, it's technically cheating to reorder your graveyard, because cards that care about graveyard order are technically legal in those formats. But if you're playing in Modern or Pioneer or Standard or some other more recent format, reordering your graveyard is perfectly fine. I think this technically means that you shouldn't be allowed to reorder your graveyard in Commander, which does allow old Graveyard Matter cards, although in general, I don't think anyone cares unless you're playing something like a Shallow Grave or a Corpse Dance or another card with Graveyard Matters in your deck. In that case, you should leave your graveyard in its natural order, or even better, play something like Fossil Find so you could stack your graveyard however you like the rest of us normal people. Anyway, those are some of my favorite cards that don't make sense anymore. Can you think of any other cards that deserve a place on this list? Let me know in the comments, and if you want even more Magic, make sure to check out the video about the plays that change the rules of the game, or maybe the one about Magic mechanics that are never coming back.